It started as just another night shift at St. Elora Regional, a place so forgettable that even the locals pretended not to know where it was, tucked behind a stretch of dying trees and a long-abandoned railroad track that used to bring in coal and hope back in the 1950s. I'd been working the graveyard shift for nearly 7 months, and by now I had fallen into the rhythm of midnight coffees, flickering fluorescent lights, and the slow drip of IVs echoing down the empty corridors. The staff was sparse after hours, just me, the security guy, Malcolm, who always wore headphones and rarely left his monitor station, Nurse Elena on the second floor, and old Dr. Rowan, who mostly stayed locked in his office unless a patient coded or wandered. But that night something felt different. It started with the temperature. I stepped into the break room to clock in and immediately felt the drop, like I'd walked into a meat locker. The heater buzzed overhead, but the air felt dead, like it had been sucked out and replaced with silence. I checked the thermostat, but it was set to a comfortable 72, and still my breath fogged in front of me. I remember shrugging it off, thinking it was just the flu trying to catch me again, and went about my usual rounds, starting with ICU, where the only patient was Mr. Latham, a coma case who'd been under for 9 months after a car crash that killed his wife and daughter. As I walked past his room, something made me stop. His monitor had a strange spike, a flat line that flickered back to normal in under 2 seconds, but it was enough to trip the alarm. I peeked in and found him exactly as I always did, still unmoving, ghost pale under the soft blue lights. But then I noticed his hand. It had moved, only slightly, but it had moved. Fingers bent just enough to leave fresh wrinkles on the sheet beneath them. I stood frozen, watching, my ears ringing. In the quiet, I reached for my walkie to call Dr. Rowan, but the device gave a sharp hiss of static and went dead in my hand. No battery icon, no light, just a dull, useless piece of plastic. That's when I realized my phone had no signal either. No bars, no Wi-Fi, just a spinning circle like it was trying to remember what its purpose was. I left ICU and headed to the nurse's station, hoping to find Elena, but she wasn't there. Her mug of peppermint tea still steamed, her clipboard half filled with notes, but no trace of her. I called out, my voice cracking the silence like a whip, but no answer came. Not even a footstep. I checked the cameras at the station's terminal, but most feeds were out, static or frozen on looping frames of empty halls and quiet rooms. The only working camera was the elevator feed, and it showed the doors on the second floor opening and closing repeatedly as if someone or something was riding it up and down. I punched the button for the elevator and waited, dread collecting in my chest like cement. When the doors opened, there was no one inside, but the walls were wet, as if someone had pressed against them with soaking clothes. I stepped in, hesitantly, the air smelling of iron and mildew, and hit the button for the second floor. The doors groaned shut, and for a second the lights flickered into darkness. In that moment, I heard breathing. Not mine. Something else. Something deep, labored, almost angry like a bull before a charge. The lights snapped back and I spun around, but the car was empty. I reached the second floor and nearly slipped stepping out. There was a trail of wet footprints leading down the hall, barefoot and small, like a child's. My stomach turned. As I followed them, each print darkening the tile like it was ink, leading toward room 214, the pediatric recovery room we hadn't used in months. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, the hinges gave a long moan, revealing a room lit only by the flickering hallway light behind me. The beds were empty, sheets tucked tight except for the one by the window. There, huddled under the covers, was a figure, a girl, maybe 6 or 7, with long black hair that hung in dripping strands over her face. I froze in place, heart pounding in my ears, and asked her name. She didn't answer. Instead, she lifted her hand and pointed to the wall behind me. I turned slowly, and the message scrawled in dark red across the pale green wallpaper read, "They never left." I backed out of the room, breath shallow, and bolted for the stairwell, racing down to the first floor, determined to find Malcolm. I found him in the security office, slumped over his desk, headphones still on, a looping camera feed of the morgue playing on his screen. His skin was pale, lips tinged blue, and his eyes wide open in terror, staring at nothing. I checked for had a pulse. Nothing. I called out his name, shook him, but he was gone, and on the screen behind him I saw something move in the morgue, a figure, tall, shrouded in white, gliding past the rows of cold drawers like it knew it was being watched. I grabbed the phone on the desk and dialed emergency dispatch, but all I heard was static, followed by a whisper that hissed, "You're too late." I dropped the phone and ran. Everywhere I went, doors slammed shut behind me, lights burst overhead, and shadows moved where they shouldn't. I tried to leave through the main entrance, but the glass doors wouldn't open. They just showed my reflection, pale and trembling, but something was wrong. My reflection was smiling, grinning wide with teeth that weren't mine. That was when I knew I wasn't alone in the hospital, and whatever else was here didn't want me to leave. The panic hadn't even fully set in before I realized just how sealed off the hospital had become, as if every hallway had elongated and twisted into some grotesque parody of its original layout. Doors no longer led to where they should, and every familiar turn now ended in an unfamiliar wing, I swear. Hadn't existed when I clocked in. I backed away from the grinning reflection in the glass entrance, but even that mockery of myself seemed to track my movements with its eyes, and as I fled down the corridor, the sound of wet footsteps echoed behind me, first soft, like something, dragging across the floor, then louder, more purposeful, more furious. I bolted left toward the trauma ward, thinking I could barricade myself inside the supply room, but when I passed the old chapel, the door creaked open slowly on its own, and a low groaning sound poured out from within, like something mourning. A sound so deep and unnatural that it made the hairs on my arms stand straight. I should have kept running, but something pulled me, some insidious curiosity or maybe fear in disguise, and I stepped inside, finding the room darker than it should have been despite the emergency lights lining the ceiling. The rows of pews were twisted, warped into spirals as if melted and reshaped by unseen hands, and the altar at the front of the chapel was soaked with something dark and dripping, pooling at the base in a slow, steady ooze. I moved closer against every instinct I had, drawn forward by the faint sound of whispering, hundreds of voices layered over one another, murmuring secrets in languages I couldn't understand, yet still felt in my bones. As I approached the altar, I saw what had replaced the crucifix above it. It was a mirror, large and cracked, and in it I saw not myself, but a hallway I'd never seen before, painted in flaking seafoam green, lined with operating room doors that had no handles. I blinked, and suddenly I wasn't in the chapel anymore. I was inside the hallway, inside the mirror, and the air was thick, almost syrupy, hard to breathe through. I turned around to go back, but the mirror was gone, replaced with a solid wall of rusted metal, and in the dim lighting I saw shapes moving behind the frosted glass of the operating rooms, shadows shifting, pressing against the glass, whispering my name, begging me to come inside. I tried each door in turn, pounding on them, screaming for help, but none opened, until I reached the last one, and it creaked inward of its own accord, revealing a surgical theater lit by swaying overhead lights, and a table in the center, with something under a bloody sheet that was still moving. I stepped inside cautiously, the door slamming shut behind me, and as I pulled back the sheet, I saw myself lying there, cut open, ribs spread, heart exposed, but still beating slowly as if trying to cling to life. My corpse eyes shot open, blood bubbling from my mouth, and it whispered in my voice, "You're the last one because they let you be," before sitting up violently, reaching for me with trembling open hands. I ran. I didn't care where. I just ran until I hit a door marked staff only and burst through it into the maintenance tunnels I'd only ever seen on blueprints. Down there everything was silent, except for the sound of water dripping and the occasional clink of metal echoing in unnatural patterns. I followed the tunnels, hoping to find an exit. But the further I went, the more it felt like the walls were closing in, breathing, pulsing like veins in a throat. And then I started hearing footsteps again, not behind me this time, but beside me, as if someone was walking in parallel through a space that shouldn't exist, just out of sight. At one junction I caught a glimpse, something tall and skeletal. with stretched, translucent skin and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark, like dying embers, watching me without blinking. I held my breath, ducked into a supply alcove, and waited. But the thing passed by, dragging what looked like a defibrillator with cables that sparked as they scraped across the concrete. When it was gone, I made my way to the ladder leading back up, and as I climbed, I felt something brush my ankle, cold and leathery. But I didn't look down. I just climbed faster, bursting through the hatch into the pharmacy storage room, panting and drenched in sweat. The hospital above had changed again. Walls were covered in old, mouldy wallpaper that hadn't been there before. Flickering lights were replaced with candle sconces that hadn't been used in decades, and the air smelled of rotting flowers and burnt hair. I navigated through unfamiliar halls that were somehow still inside my familiar hospital, and that's when I heard the intercom crackle to life for the first time all night. A voice, mine, but not mine, spoke in a monotone, listing off names of people I worked with. Dr. Rowan, Nurse Elena, Malcolm, Patient Latham, one by one repeating, looping, until it added a new name, you, and then fell silent with a high-pitched whine. I stumbled into the staff break room, hoping to collect myself, but when I turned on the light, I found the walls were lined with Polaroids, dozens, maybe hundreds, each one depicting me at different angles, some from behind, some while sleeping, others that I swear were taken just minutes ago. And pinned in the center of the wall was a note, scrawled in childlike handwriting. "You're the last one left. Don't disappoint us." My knees buckled and I dropped into the nearest chair, the cold biting into my skin like knives, and I realized then that this wasn't just a haunting. It was something ancient, something that had been waiting, watching, and now it had me, and I had no idea how to escape. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed in that break room with the Polaroids surrounding me like a gallery of nightmares, curated by something that clearly had been watching long before I ever realized, because time had started to lose all meaning. The clock on the wall had melted like wax, its hands twisted into unnatural angles, and the air itself vibrated with a hum so low it resonated in my bones more than in my ears. I kept trying to rationalize it, to believe I'd suffered some kind of breakdown or was hallucinating from a gas leak or sleep deprivation, but every logical thought was drowned by the rising tide of dread inside me, a dread that only grew heavier. When I noticed something new on the table, an old pager, the kind that hadn't been used in hospitals for over a decade, buzzing silently, its small cracked screen flashing one word over and over again. "Look." With shaking hands I picked it up, and the moment my fingers touched it, the break room vanished. The air rushed out of my lungs as I was yanked violently into darkness, the kind of absolute void that made you question if you still had a body at all, until slowly the darkness shifted, shaped itself into a dim corridor that smelled of antiseptic and rot, its walls slick with moisture and streaked with something too thick to be water. I stumbled forward, guided by the flicker of weak fluorescent lights overhead that buzzed like dying flies, and at the far end of the hallway was a shape slumped against the wall, someone in scrubs, unmoving. I approached cautiously, heart hammering, in my chest, and when I got close enough to see their face, my breath caught in my throat. It was me again, or at least it looked like me, but older, worn, covered in cuts and bruises, eyes sunken deep into a pale face that barely clung to life. He looked up at me and opened his mouth, but instead of words, a thick black sludge poured out, splattering onto the floor and seeping toward my feet like it had a mind of its own. And then his body began to twitch violently, bones cracking, contorting as he started to stand, no rise, lifted by something invisible. Like a marionette on tangled strings, his arms hanging limp as his head lolled back, mouth still dripping with the sludge. I backed away, turned to run, but the hallway behind me had vanished, replaced with walls of flesh that pulsed with each thud of my heart, and veins snaked across the ceiling, dripping something acidic that burned the floor in slow, deliberate sizzles. I had no choice but to push forward, darting past the twitching version of myself, down a staircase that hadn't been there a moment ago, the steps seemingly endless, spiraling downward like I was descending into the core of something not meant to be understood. The air grew colder with each step, and the deeper I went, the more I could hear them, voices whispering secrets I wasn't meant to know, promises of escape wrapped in threats of madness, and I swear some of them were familiar, like old co-workers I hadn't seen in years or patients who had long since died. At the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in what looked like a morgue, but everything was wrong. The drawers were too large, stacked higher than the ceiling should have allowed, and the tags dangling from them bore not just names, but dates and final thoughts scrawled in shaky handwriting. I shouldn't have answered the intercom. Don't trust the third-floor nurse. He's wearing Dr. Rowan's skin, and worst of all, on the lowest drawer, my name followed by "You died the moment you started your shift." Before I could open it, I heard something dragging across the floor behind me, a wet, slithering sound, and I turned to see a figure crawling out from the shadows, limbs too long, fingers clawed and stained with something dark, its mouth wide, open but filled not with teeth but with eyes, all of them blinking in perfect synchronization as it reached for me. I ran, slipping past the drawer, through a swinging door that led into what looked like the pediatric wing, but every bed was overturned, IV poles bent and jammed into the floor, and mobiles spun in slow circles over cribs filled with rotten fruit instead of infants. The walls here were scribbled with crayon drawings, childish depictions of doctors and nurses with hollow eyes and claws for hands, standing over stick-figure patients with red X's for eyes, and in the corner of each drawing was a small symbol I didn't recognize, like an eye with teeth grinning wide. I kept moving, trying not to think, just act, because that's the only way I felt like I could stay ahead of whatever this place had become. And that's when I saw it, the security office, still intact, its monitors flickering, offering maybe some shred of sense in this chaos. I burst in and slammed the door behind me, locking it tight, and turned to the monitors, praying to see something normal, something explainable, but the feeds were wrong. They showed not just the hospital, but impossible versions of it, ones where gravity failed, where patients crawled across the ceilings, where I watched myself walk past a hallway I knew I hadn't entered yet. Some feeds showed surgeries happening with no doctors, just shadows operating with invisible hands, and one showed the break room again, but this time I was still sitting in it, frozen, eyes wide, with something large and black crouched behind me, whispering into my ear as my body slowly decayed in real time. I turned away, bile rising in my throat, and that's when I noticed the emergency phone buzzing, a dusty ancient model, its cord frayed and sparking, but vibrating insistently. I picked it up, hand trembling, and heard a voice that made every cell in my body go cold. It was my mother's voice, but she'd been dead for 10 years, and she was sobbing, whispering, "I'm sorry, I didn't know they'd come for you too," before the line went dead and the receiver melted in my hand. I backed into the corner, desperate for something, anything that would explain this, that would offer a way out, and I noticed a map of the hospital on the wall, but it was unlike any layout I'd ever seen. It included floors that didn't exist, sublevels marked with symbols, and one red circle deep underground labeled only as the heart. And that's when I knew I had to go there, whatever it was, because this place wasn't going to let me leave unless I unraveled the truth at its core, unless I confronted whatever was puppeteering this nightmare and dragging me deeper into its rotten lungs. And so I unlocked the door, stepped back into the shifting hallways, and whispered to myself like a mantra, "Get to the heart or die trying." I didn't look back as I left the security office behind, afraid of what I might see, afraid that the feed showing my own rotting form might suddenly reflect my reality instead of some alternate nightmare. And as I stepped into the hallway, everything shifted around me again. The sterile hospital floors gave way to damp, uneven stone, as if I had crossed some invisible threshold into an older, forgotten structure beneath the foundation of the building itself. And the scent hit me immediately, a pungent mix of mildew, decay, and something metallic, like rusted iron soaked in blood. The light overhead was gone, replaced by flickering torches embedded into the walls, their flames casting dancing shadows that moved with more intention than the flicker of fire should allow, and every step echoed down the corridor louder than it should have, like the walls were listening, amplifying my presence for whatever waited in the deeper dark. I kept moving, every inch of me trembling as I followed the crudely drawn map in my mind, trying to make sense of a layout that defied architecture, a maze that shouldn't exist but did. Each hallway seemed to stretch impossibly long until it didn't, cutting off suddenly into alcoves or spiral staircases that descended and descended, until I was sure I must be miles below the surface, deeper than the hospital ever could have reached on any blueprint. And the further I went, the more I began to notice the symbols again. The eye with teeth, the spiral marked in crimson on the walls, sometimes drawn in what looked disturbingly like human fingernail scratches. Whispers followed me down every corridor, soft and indistinct at first, but growing louder, more insistent, and they always came from the walls, as if the hospital itself had grown a voice, or many voices, all layered on top of each other like a choir of lunatics humming lullabies to a child that never existed. And at some point I passed an operating theatre, except it wasn't one I recognized. It was older, with rusted equipment, glass jars full of floating organs labeled in Latin, and a table in the center stained so deeply with blood it looked as though it had been soaked over centuries, and standing around it were 6 figures dressed in outdated surgical gowns, their faces obscured by cracked porcelain masks that were eerily childlike in design, like doll faces, their hands frozen, mid-motion as though I had caught them in the act. One held a scalpel that glinted unnaturally in the flickering light, and when I dared to step closer, their heads all turned in perfect unison to face me, the masks cracking with a creak like breaking bone, revealing gaping voids beneath where their faces should have been. And in that moment I ran, heart hammering against my ribs, lungs burning, until I crashed through another rusted door and found myself in a wide hallway lined with doors that pulsed like flesh, each one breathing slightly, their handles shaped like vertebrae. And I realized I was now inside the hospital's memory. Some kind of dreamscape echo created by everything that had happened in this place. Every trauma, every death, every scream soaked into the walls and given form. And as I passed one door, I could hear a woman wailing behind it, her voice rising in a pitch so high it bordered on inhuman, and the next door rattled violently as something scratched at it from the other side, begging in a child's voice to be let out. I didn't stop to investigate. I didn't need to see what was behind them because I could feel it in my bones, in that ancient part of the brain that knows when something is wrong, something primordial. And I followed the hallway until it split into 2, with one path descending into a tunnel filled with a red mist that clung to the ground like liquid fog, and the other leading toward a room labeled Observation in large block letters that pulsed softly with a dull yellow glow. I chose the mist, perhaps foolishly, but something about the observation room radiated an artificial calm, like it wanted me to go there, and I had long stopped trusting anything that wanted anything from me. So I entered the tunnel, immediately, overcome by the smell of rot so strong I gagged, pulling my sleeve over my mouth as I pushed forward, and within minutes I could no longer see the walls, only the mist and the occasional shape of something crawling across the ceiling, always, just out of reach, watching. I kept moving until the mist abruptly ended, and I found myself in a chamber lined with hospital beds, each one containing a patient covered from head to toe in white sheets, unmoving, silent, but each with a monitor at their side that beeped, in rhythm to my heartbeat, and I don't know why I did it. Maybe some part of me needed to confirm, but I pulled back the sheet on the nearest bed and found my own face staring back at me, eyes open, mouth sewn shut with surgical thread. And on the monitor was not a heartbeat, but a countdown, ticking down from a 2:17. And when I looked around, every monitor on every bed ticked down in unison, and I knew then, with a clarity that chilled me, that when it reached 0, something was going to change, something final. I ran again, this time through a door at the far end of the chamber that led into a hallway so narrow I had to squeeze sideways through it, the walls pressing inward like a throat trying to swallow me. And on the other side was a room I didn't expect, a perfect replica of my childhood bedroom, down to the faded posters, the crack in the ceiling I used to stare at when I couldn't sleep. And sitting on the bed was my mother, or something that wore her shape, humming softly and rocking back and forth, and when she looked up at me, her eyes were gone, replaced with swirling black voids that reflected everything and nothing at once. And she spoke in a voice layered with others, dozens of others, male and female, young and old, saying, "You're almost there, sweetheart. The heart is waiting. I stepped back, overwhelmed, and the room melted around me like wax in heat, shifting into a spiral staircase that wound downward into absolute darkness, and I had no choice but to descend, the air growing colder with each step, the whispers returning, this time speaking in unison. "Come and see, come and see, come and see." And when I reached the bottom, I found myself in a circular chamber of stone and bone, at the center of which pulsed a massive organic structure shaped like a human heart, easily the size of a car, suspended by tendrils that stretched into the ceiling and floor, and it throbbed with a rhythm that wasn't my own but matched the countdown on those monitors perfectly. I approached cautiously, overwhelmed by the sheer wrongness of it, and as I did, a voice spoke from everywhere and nowhere. "You were never supposed to leave. You are the anomaly. You are the infection." And before I could respond, tendrils lashed out, grabbing my arms, legs, wrapping around my torso, lifting me off the ground and pulling me toward the beating mass. And in that moment, a clarity struck me like lightning. This thing, this heart, it was the hospital, or at least its core consciousness, formed by centuries of death, pain, fear, all soaked into the walls and birthed into sentience, and it had been feeding off us, manipulating us, creating scenarios to keep the fear fresh and strong, like a farmer tending crops. And I was now fertilizer. But I wasn't ready to die. Not yet, not like this. And I reached into my pocket, pulled out the old pager, which was now buzzing violently, flashing now on its tiny screen, and without thinking I shoved it into the heart. The glass, cracking, the device sparking, and the moment it made contact, everything screamed, the room, the walls, the heart, even my own voice joining in involuntarily, as a blinding light erupted, and I was flung backward, slamming into the stone floor hard enough to crack ribs. And when I opened my eyes again, everything was silent, still, and the heart was no longer beating. When I came to, the silence was suffocating. Not the peaceful kind, but the type that presses down on you like the heavy air before a tornado, pregnant with unsaid things and lurking aftermaths. And as I pushed myself up from the cold stone floor, every joint and rib ached, but I was somehow alive, breathing, heart pounding in my ears, but still my own, and not that of the massive organic monstrosity that had pulsed like a grotesque god in the center of the room before the pager destroyed it, or at least damaged it enough to stop the ritual that was trying to consume me. And I staggered to my feet, blinking against the dark, which had returned to being the dim hallway light of a hospital corridor, clean and sterile and completely empty. It was the hospital again, just the hospital, as if the nightmare had been buried beneath a thick layer of drywall and fluorescent bulbs. And yet I knew it was still here, only retreating, hiding, and for a brief moment I questioned if I'd finally hallucinated the entire ordeal, some sort of psychotic break after working too many double shifts in a place soaked with grief and quiet death. But then I looked down at my arm and saw the burn marks where the tendrils had grabbed me, red and blistering, and I realized none of it had been imagined. Something had changed in the hospital, that much was certain. The humming had stopped, the lights weren't flickering anymore, and the temperature had returned to something almost normal, but the air still felt thick, like a deep breath before the plunge. And I walked down the hallway with tentative steps, each footfall echoing just a bit too loudly, passing empty rooms that now looked abandoned instead of haunted, stripped bare of the twitching shadows or mirrored figures. And I reached the nurses' station and found the monitors blank, as if whatever presence had once infested the camera feeds was now gone, or hiding deeper, and the intercom no longer hissed or whispered, and I should have felt relief, but I didn't. I felt watched, as if the building itself was biding time, not vanquished, just wounded and waiting. And then I saw something new, a file folder resting on the counter with my name on it, written in crisp block letters that didn't match any of the handwriting I'd ever seen from admin or HR, and I opened it with trembling fingers to find a series of photos, images taken from inside the hospital during moments I had lived through over the last few nights. But from angles I never noticed anyone standing in, as if someone or something had been documenting my every step. And in the final photo, I was staring up at the camera, directly into the lens. Blood smeared across my face and my eyes completely blacked out with ink, and written on the back of that photo in looping cursive were the words, "The infection spreads when no one is looking. I dropped the photo like it had burned me and backed away from the counter, but there was nowhere to go that didn't feel tainted, and I knew in my gut the hospital wasn't done with me yet. It had simply changed its strategy, evolved like a predator learning that brute force wasn't enough and now opting for psychological warfare. And I made my way to the basement, because that was the one place I hadn't fully explored, the morgue and storage wings, and if anything was hiding, it would be there. Tucked into the corners of the hospital no one wanted to acknowledge, and the elevator ride down felt longer than usual, the numbers above the doors blinking in strange patterns that didn't match the floor numbers, and at one point, the lights went out entirely, only to flicker back on to reveal that I was no longer alone. Standing next to me was a nurse, or the shape of one, her uniform pristine, but her face completely featureless, like smooth plastic, and her head slowly turned toward me even without eyes to see. And I pressed myself against the wall, barely holding back a scream, until the doors dinged and opened to the basement. And she was gone, vanished as if she had never been there at all. The basement was colder than before, unnaturally so, and my breath fogged in front of me as I stepped out onto the concrete. The flickering fluorescent lights above casting a pale blue glow over the gurneys and equipment covered in white sheets that seemed to move ever so slightly, like they were breathing, and I made my way to the morgue, past the industrial freezers and storage closets that had long since been emptied. And as I opened the door, a wave of rot hit me that nearly dropped me to my knees. Not the usual scent of decay I'd become numb to, but something deeper, older, like the smell of a forgotten tomb suddenly disturbed, and the temperature dropped again, sharply, until frost formed on the edges of the doorframe. Inside, the morgue was not as I remembered it, no longer a room of drawers and tagged corpses, but a vast chamber stretching far beyond its physical boundaries, filled with endless rows of bodies suspended upright in tubes of liquid, eyes open, mouths agape, floating in silence, and at the far end stood a figure, me or a version of me, dressed in a tattered lab coat, clipboard in hand, scribbling notes as he observed the bodies. I called out, but he didn't respond, and when I stepped closer, he finally looked up, and I'll never forget the expression on that face, a mixture of pity and resignation, like he was looking at a dying patient already beyond saving, and he spoke in my voice but with no emotion. "You've seen too much. You're becoming part of it now." And as he said that, I felt something crawl beneath my skin, something that wasn't entirely foreign, something I had felt the first time I heard the hum and saw the flicker in the hallway mirror, and I screamed, grabbing a nearby scalpel and dragging it across my forearm, needing to know if what I was feeling was real. And as the blood poured out, black and thick like tar, I realized he was right. Whatever the heart had been, it hadn't died when I attacked it. It had planted something in me, a seed, and it was growing slowly, waiting for the right moment to bloom, and the other me simply turned and walked into the shadows of the morgue, vanishing between the rows of suspended corpses, leaving me alone with the horrifying knowledge that I was becoming the next conduit, the next voice, the next thing that would walk these halls and manipulate reality. And I stumbled out of the morgue, sobbing, my arm burning and dripping with inky blood that steamed against the cold floor. And as I collapsed in the hallway, I heard the overhead speakers crackle to life once again, that same childlike voice returning, distorted and glitching. "Welcome home. You were always meant to stay." I screamed until my throat gave out, until the pain overtook the fear and the darkness returned, wrapping around me like a blanket of wet soil, and I woke up hours later, or maybe days, in a hospital bed in room 311, the heart monitor next to me beeping in slow rhythm, the fluorescent lights humming like they always had, and a nurse walked in, her smile too wide, her eyes too still, and she whispered, "You made it back." But the question is, which version of you did? Before turning and leaving, locking the door behind her. And now I sit here, writing this down with trembling hands, not because I think it will save me, but because I need someone to know. If you ever find yourself working the night shift here, don't follow the humming, don't answer the pager, and whatever you do, don't go looking for the places the map doesn't show, because this hospital remembers, and it doesn't let go. There are moments where I catch myself wondering if I ever truly escaped the basement, Or if everything since then, this hospital bed, the occasional visit from the nurses with their too white shoes and impossibly smooth skin, the clipboard rounds conducted by silent doctors who write notes but never ask questions, is simply part of a dream layered over something darker, something meant to keep me quiet and still, while the truth continues to pulse beneath the surface like the veins of a buried thing. And the more I try to piece things together, the more I start noticing the cracks in the illusion. The way the digital clock in my room always reads 3:13. No matter when I check it, or how the IV drip never seems to deplete, the bag just refilling itself every time I blink too long, and sometimes I hear tapping from the inside of the walls, not like rats or wiring, but like fingernails, deliberate and rhythmic. And last night, or what I assume was night, the intercom turned on by itself again, no voices this time, just a low hiss and then a tone, like the start of an emergency broadcast, except it didn't go anywhere, just repeated the same 5 notes over and over, until I started bleeding from the nose and passed out from the pressure building in my skull. When I came to, I was no longer in the hospital bed, but standing barefoot in the hallway, gown torn and blood on my hands, and the floor beneath me had transformed. No longer tile, but soft, like flesh, and it pulsed underfoot with every beat of my racing heart. And down the corridor I saw the silhouettes of people I knew to be dead. Mr. Long from the psych wing, who'd hung himself last month, Nurse Diane, who went missing after a double shift and was found dismembered in the tea boiler room, and even Ellis, my friend, the only person I trusted here, who had disappeared the night I first heard the humming, and they all stood in the distance watching me, mouths open, no sound escaping, their eyes weeping black tears as they pointed down a hallway that shouldn't exist, a hallway that twisted in upon itself like an M.C. Escher painting done in meat and memory. And I followed because what else could I do? What else was there but to obey the hospital's call? And with every step I took, the walls shifted, snapshots of my own memories flashing across the surfaces like film reels stitched into the drywall, scenes from my childhood, my mother dying in her bed surrounded by beeping machines, my first day in med school, the moment I signed my contract to work this cursed night shift, and as I walked deeper, the memories began changing, warping into things I didn't recognize, like dreams borrowed from someone else, faces that weren't mine smiling through my mouth, hands that weren't mine holding scalpels and laughing as patients screamed, and I realized the hospital wasn't just absorbing people, it was feeding on them, digesting their essence and keeping fragments as echoes, looping them over and over until they became indistinguishable from the building itself. And then I reached the end of the corridor, a door that looked exactly like the one to my own apartment, complete with the chipped paint I'd meant to fix, and the rusted number 204 hanging slightly crooked, and without thinking I opened it, and stepped into my living room, but not as I left it. Everything was covered in plastic, like a crime scene or a house waiting to be fumigated, and sitting on the couch was a woman with her back to me, long black hair spilling over the cushions, and the television was playing static. But underneath, the white noise, I heard a child crying softly, and as I stepped closer, the woman turned, and it was my mother, or something wearing her face, eyes hollow, mouth too wide, tongue flickering like a serpent's, and she said, "You left me here," and the plastic began to peel from the walls, revealing more bodies underneath, cocooned in film, twitching, whispering, and I ran. I ran back through the door, but the hospital was gone, and in its place was a forest, endless and black, trees like columns stretching into a starless sky, and I realized the hospital had shifted again, had reformed its prison into something more primal, more terrifying, because it knew I was beginning to understand how it worked. It needed to keep me lost, keep me confused, because clarity was the one thing that could unravel its hold. And so it adapted, creating new horrors from my memories, new environments from the deepest cracks in my psyche. And as I wandered the forest, I came upon a clearing where the ground pulsed and breathed, and at its center was a massive sculpture made of bone and rebar, vaguely human in shape, its chest cavity hollow and throbbing, and I heard my own voice echoing from within it, begging for help, screaming, apologies, reciting things I'd never said aloud. And when I approached, I saw that the sculpture was built from the remains of the hospital staff, all those who had vanished, all those who had given in, And I was next, my bones already aching, my skin tightening as if preparing to be stretched over the structure. And I screamed, clawing at the ground, at the trees, at my own arms, trying to wake up. But there was no waking, only falling, deeper and deeper into the simulation, the theater of nightmares the hospital had constructed. And suddenly, I was in surgery again in the OR. Tools laid out, lights above me blindingly bright, and the patient on the table was me, chest open, organs exposed, and a circle of doctors stood around me, faceless and humming. And I realized they were operating not to save me, but to transform me, to make me one of them. And the humming was back, not just a sound, but a language, a prayer. And I started to understand the words, and that scared me more than anything else, because the moment you understand the song, you become part of it. You sing back, and I bit my tongue to silence myself, the taste of blood snapping me out of the trance, and I broke free, staggering away from the table. But every hallway I ran into led back to the OR, as if the hospital had compacted into a single room, endlessly folding over itself, and I finally stopped running because I realized the truth. I was no longer trying to escape a physical place, but an idea, a curse, a story that had chosen me as its narrator, and the only way out was to rewrite it, to reclaim my agency. And so I found a pen, an actual physical pen, resting on a tray beside a file marked "Discharge," and I began to write. Not a report, not a medical summary, but my own words, messy and raw, describing everything I'd seen, every horror, every transformation. And as I wrote, the world around me flickered, the walls shimmered, the humming distorted, and I realized I was fighting back, carving my own version of reality into the narrative the hospital had tried to force on me. And maybe it wouldn't last. Maybe the story would simply absorb my version like it had so many others. But for now, I felt control return. If only a sliver. And when I looked up from the page, I was back in my hospital bed, the clipboard resting on my lap, the words still there, real and solid, and for the first time in days, weeks, months, I heard nothing but silence, not the bad kind this time, but the stillness that comes after a storm has passed. And I thought, just maybe, I had a chance, a way to fight this thing on its own terms, and I whispered into the dark, "I'm not done yet." And the shadows around me retreated. Not fully, not forever, but just enough for me to breathe, and that was something. There's a unique kind of dread that seeps into your bones when you realize the rules of reality are no longer static, when logic and physics begin to peel away like wallpaper soaked in old blood, and you're left with nothing but instinct and madness to guide you through the ever-warping nightmare. And in the hours, if time still functioned as such, that followed my return to the hospital bed, I found that reality had begun to blur at the seams, not in a metaphorical sense, but in the literal disintegration of the fabric of the world I'd once known. Walls would bend and breathe like lungs. The ceiling would occasionally ripple as if water ran beneath it, and the lighting was no longer static, pulsing dim to blinding and back again in slow, nauseating waves that syncopated with the thumping of my heart. And yet no one else in the hospital seemed to notice if they even still existed, because as far as I could tell, I was alone again, alone except for the echoes, the soft scuffing of footsteps that would pause the moment I did, the gentle creak of hinges that never quite revealed their doors, and the whispers that were always just too low to understand, but always just close enough to know they were about me. I tried to keep my mind grounded by anchoring myself to routine, documenting every shift in my notebook, tracking the changes in environment, in sensation, in thought, and that's when I noticed something terrifyingly consistent. Every night, at exactly 4:44 a.m., no matter where I was, the world would freeze for exactly 44 seconds, a complete halt where nothing moved, not even the flicker of lights or the hum of machines. And during those 44 seconds, I was no longer alone. During those moments, I could feel a presence pressing against the veil of existence, like a child's fingers on fogged glass. And I knew if I ever moved during that time, if I so much as breathed, it would see me, and the consequences of that were far beyond comprehension. And so I trained myself to remain utterly still, counting each heartbeat, praying that I wouldn't betray myself with a twitch, and this nightly ritual became a kind of religion for me, the one consistent thread in a tapestry of unraveling madness. But the hospital had other plans. It always did. And I should have known it would escalate. It always escalates. Because once the House of Horrors learns you've adapted, it reshapes the game board. And that's exactly what happened on the 7th night of the freeze, when instead of silence I heard something breathing behind me during the 44 seconds of stillness. A wet, raspy inhale-exhale that grew closer with each second, until I could feel its breath against the nape of my neck, and the urge to scream, to run, to move was overwhelming. But I held, I endured, and when time resumed, I collapsed to the floor, my muscles screaming and my eyes watering. And I was alone again. But on the mirror opposite the hospital room's bed was a smear, not of blood but of something grey and oily, and in the centre a single fingerprint pressed in, as if someone had touched it from the other side. And from that point on, the entity did not wait for the stillness. It began showing up in reflective surfaces, in darkened windows and stainless steel trays, always just out of focus, always watching, always waiting. And that's when I realized it wasn't just haunting me. It was studying me, learning from me, adapting the same way I was adapting to the hospital. And suddenly the idea that I was simply trapped became far more horrifying. Because what if I wasn't just a prisoner? What if I was a test subject, and the hospital was the petri dish? And that thought took root, deep and persistent, infecting every waking moment. And it all came to a head when I found a door in the east wing that hadn't been there before. A narrow, blackened frame that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat and radiated a cold that stung the skin. And despite every instinct screaming at me to run, I opened it, because by then I had accepted a horrible truth. Curiosity was no longer mine. It belonged to the hospital, and it had already puppeteered my choices for days, maybe weeks. And the door led not to a room but to a stairwell that twisted impossibly downward, deeper than the foundation should have allowed, and the walls were lined with photos, hundreds, maybe thousands of patients and staff, most of whom I recognized as the missing. And beneath each photo was a small tag with 3 numbers and a phrase in Latin that I translated later as "not yet processed." And the staircase went on, and the deeper I went, the heavier the air became, not in temperature but in presence, like walking into a cathedral where something divine had died, and its ghost still lingered in the rafters. And at the bottom, I found a room, a cavern, really, filled with machinery that was half biological. Wires that pulsed with fluid, gears made of bone, monitors that flickered with static but occasionally flashed images of my own memories, always warped, always wrong. And in the center was a chair, a grotesque imitation of a dentist's seat, fitted with restraints and surrounded by syringes filled with glowing black liquid. And on the wall behind it was a screen that simply read, "Begin recording." And that was the moment I realized that everything, the hauntings, the disappearances, the nightmares, they were inputs, stimuli fed into me to see what I would do, how I would break, how long it would take before I gave in. And I was meant to sit in that chair, to be recorded, to be finalized. But I didn't. I ran, blindly, madly, through the twisting corridors that had no right to exist, chased not by footsteps but by ideas, by half-thoughts and fragments of other people's minds echoing around me in languages I didn't speak, but somehow understood. And when I finally emerged back into the hospital proper, I collapsed in the OR, shaking, sobbing, the weight of comprehension nearly crushing me. And that's when Ellis appeared, not a vision or a ghost, but real, bloodied and gaunt, eyes wild. And he grabbed me and said, "You saw it too, didn't you?" The processing room. And I couldn't speak, just nodded, and he explained, rushed and frantic, that he'd been hiding, moving through the walls, that there were others, maybe, but the hospital kept thinning them out, adjusting the simulation, to remove the variables. And that's when we made a plan, our only hope, to document everything, to flood the hospital's system with narrative, because stories are how the mind makes sense of chaos. And maybe, just maybe, if we could write enough of them, we could overload the system, create too many threads to be tied up, and force it to crash, to release us. And so we started writing, carving words into the walls, into our skin, whispering them into the cameras, chanting them into the vents, until the very structure of the hospital began to react. Lights dimming, alarms blaring, walls groaning as if in protest, and we knew we were close. So close. And then Ellis disappeared again, taken mid-sentence, a scream cut off by silence, and I was alone with the pen, with the pages, and I kept writing, because it's the only weapon I have left. And if you're hearing this, if these words have reached outside, then maybe, just maybe, the story is spreading, and the hospital can't contain it forever. And maybe I'm still alive, or maybe I'm just another echo in its endless halls. But either way, I'll keep going, because this story isn't over. Not yet. There's a strange liberation that comes with hopelessness, not the kind born of despair or surrender, but the kind that bubbles up when you've seen behind the curtain and realized there's nothing left to fear, because everything that can go wrong already has. And that was the mental state I found myself in as I crawled out from under the shattered MRI machine that had exploded during what I could only describe as a psychic overload. The night after Ellis vanished, one moment, I was whispering into the darkened scanner, feeding it names, memories, lies, truths, whatever I could come up with to confuse the system. And the next, the lights turned crimson. Alarms I'd never heard before began blaring in broken reverse time signatures, and the entire room vibrated with a sound I could only describe as what a dying god might scream if it still had vocal cords. And then boom, and then boom. Metal twisted like taffy. Screens shattered inward as though they were under pressure from within, and I was hurled against the far wall where I blacked out for seconds, minutes, maybe hours. Time no longer mattered here, not in this haunted diosphere where walls had memories and shadows wore names. And when I woke, I was bleeding from my ears, my head pulsing like a blown speaker. But I was laughing, because I knew I'd caused damage, real damage, to whatever was running the show. And that gave me strength, not just survival instinct, but defiance, the will to fight back. And that was when the other shifts started appearing, distorted. Versions of me, flickering in and out of the corners of rooms, caught briefly in reflective surfaces. Versions of myself doing different tasks, sometimes screaming silently, sometimes holding scalpel-sized objects I didn't want to recognize. And I realized the hospital wasn't just feeding on me, it was splitting me, creating echoes, variants, timelines where I'd made different choices, said different things. And I began to wonder if I was even the original anymore, or just one of the more stable copies, and that terror settled into my bones like radiation. But I couldn't stop, because the more noise I made, the more fractures appeared in the facade. Corridors began intersecting impossibly. Patients I'd seen dead in early days now walked the halls repeating singular phrases. Can I go home now? Or did you get my blood work? Like broken animatronics. And when I approached them, their eyes would roll back to reveal mirrors where pupils should have been, and sometimes they'd glitch in and out of place like old VHS tracking errors. And worse, so much worse, were the children. The ones that had never been in this hospital before, who didn't belong here at all, pale, hairless, eyeless things that would crawl across ceilings and walls, whispering in reverse speech, chanting numbers I couldn't decipher, until I played one of my recordings backward and heard my own voice screaming them. And I realized the hospital was turning my voice, my breath, my words into a virus of its own, an echo weapon. And maybe that's why I started talking less, holding words in my throat like barbed wire. But silence didn't help either, because then they would speak for me. All the variant me's stepping out of shadows and lockers and bedsheets to whisper my thoughts out loud, with just enough difference to make me question if I'd ever really thought them at all. And all of this came to a head when I found the Black Ward, a section of the hospital that appeared one morning without warning, a hallway with no light, no sound, just a void. And when I stepped through the threshold, my body felt wrong. Heavier, slower, like gravity had thickened, and the air was syrupy, heavy with something that tasted like rot and electricity, and inside were rows of beds, each occupied by something I didn't want to see, covered in gauze soaked through with ink, not blood. And each one had a monitor above it, showing a different version of my face, distorted, emaciated, enraged, and one of them began to twitch as I passed, its head slowly turning under the wrappings to follow me. And I ran through the corridor. As the beds began to convulse, the machines screeching flat lines even though none of the figures inside were dying. No, they were waking up, and when I finally slammed through the exit door at the end of the black ward, I found myself not back in the hospital proper, but in a perfect recreation of my childhood bedroom, down to the posters on the wall and the smell of old wood and detergent. And sitting on the bed was my mother, but not my mother, not really. This one had hollow eyes and a voice that echoed even when she whispered, and she told me that I'd been a very bad boy waking the others before they were ready. And then her face melted into that of my last patient before the collapse, the one who'd coded despite perfect vitals, and I screamed, not in fear, but rage, because I understood. Now, the hospital wasn't just a place, it was a network, a simulation lab running thousands of horror scenarios like spiritual malware, an ancient machine disguised as a building, feeding on human fear to generate power, or purpose, or maybe just entertainment for something we'd never understand, and the only way out was to burn it all down. Not literally, that had already failed, but narratively, structurally, to rip the threads of its stories until it collapsed under its own contradictions. So I went back to every corridor, every ward, every hidden room, and I began retelling what happened, differently each time, flooding the halls with alternate versions, false endings, unreliable narrator monologues shouted at security cameras and scratched into IV bags. And slowly, the building began to distort further. Nurses frozen mid-walk, operating rooms melting into gymnasiums, ceiling tiles falling to reveal stars. Instead of wiring, and I knew then that I was getting close, the infection of story was working, unraveling the machine. But it was fighting back too, flooding my mind with dreams so vivid I couldn't tell if I was waking up or falling deeper. And I started losing time again, hours vanishing, only to find myself in places I hadn't meant to go, doing things I couldn't remember. And then the worst happened. I saw myself on one of the monitors in real time walking toward the morgue with something heavy in my arms, humming a tune I didn't know. And when I chased the image, I found the freezer room empty, save for a mirror where one shouldn't be. And when I looked in, my reflection blinked late, its mouth curling into a grin mine didn't match, and I punched it, hard. And my fist bled, but so did the reflection, and its blood was black and thick and alive, curling like smoke on the mirror's surface. And in that moment, I knew the final stage was near. The confrontation, not with the hospital, but with myself, with whatever fragment of me had fused with this place. And as I write this now, carving it into the floor beneath what used to be the main security office, I can feel it approaching. The other me, the darker me, the accepted version, the one the hospital wants. And I know that if I don't finish this story before he arrives, before he takes over fully, the real me will vanish, overwritten, consumed, and all that will be left is a grinning shadow in nurse scrubs, walking the endless night shift forever. And so I write and write and write, because it's the only weapon I have left, the only thing they can't predict, the only variable they can't fully model, the human capacity to reshape reality through narrative. And if you're reading this, if you've made it this far, then remember this. The hospital lies, but stories never die. In the aftermath of what I experienced in that chamber, the heart room, the place where I found my original self and discovered the truth of my existence, I had no time to process the enormity of it all. The world was collapsing around me, the room stretching and crumbling. And yet somehow I was standing there, still alive, still in one piece, more or less. The echo of my screams reverberated in my skull, but I knew they couldn't be heard. I wasn't supposed to exist in this space. I wasn't supposed to know what I knew. My very consciousness was an anomaly, an experiment, and in the deepest corners of my mind, the cold realization settled. I wasn't just a part of the hospital's twisted system. I was the core of it. The narrative, the illusion that had held me in place for so long, was designed to feed off of me, to create new loops, new experiences, all wrapped around a core truth that had been buried deep in my subconscious for so long. A truth I had just uncovered and had no choice but to accept. The hospital wasn't trying to fix me or heal me. It was trying to replace me. A system designed not to care for the sick, but to harvest their essence, to steal their identities, their memories, and then let them go, or more accurately, forget them. and I had become the ghost within this machine. But the more I pieced together, the more I began to realize there was still hope, still a shred of possibility that I could break free. The truth was out there, buried in layers of false memories and corrupted timelines. If I could just figure out how to break the code of this place, I could escape. But how could I break something that had been built with so much precision, so much intention? I needed answers, and the only place I could think to go was deeper into the hospital. The sub-levels that I had once believed were closed off, where the rooms with no names stood, where the halls twisted and stretched in impossible ways. Those were the places where the true experiments were held, where the patients who had never been patients were stored, the ones who had been tested on and discarded, left to wander in the dark until they were nothing more than shadows themselves. And so I made my way down through corridors I didn't recognize and into the elevator that always seemed to descend too far, past the floors where the living and the dead were mixed, past the morgue, past the surgical suites, until it opened into a space I had never seen before. The walls were thick, almost as if they were built to contain the echoes of screams that no one would ever hear. The air was thick with something heavy, metallic. I knew then that this wasn't just another wing of the hospital. It was the heart of it. I stepped out, hesitating for just a moment before I walked down the corridor, knowing there would be no turning back now. This was it. This was where the answers were, where the final pieces of this nightmare puzzle would be revealed. But as I walked through the shadowy halls, I began to hear the whispers again. Not from the walls or the ceilings this time, but from somewhere else, from the corners of my mind. They had been there for days now, subtle at first, but now louder, more insistent. They spoke of something I hadn't considered before, something darker than I could have ever imagined. I tried to block them out, to focus on the present, but it was like the very air was saturated with their presence, suffocating me, drowning me in a sea of voices. They were the voices of the hospital's creations, the ones that had been pulled from the very fabric of reality, stitched together, from scraps of memory and data, and their cries were not ones of agony but of yearning for freedom, for release from this prison they were trapped in. I turned the corner and stopped dead in my tracks. There in front of me was a figure, a woman, or at least she looked like a woman. Her face was pale, her eyes black as coal, and her lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was standing in the doorway to one of the rooms, but as I looked at her, I realized she wasn't just standing there, she was waiting for me. I felt a cold rush of fear flood my veins, but it wasn't just her presence that chilled me. It was the overwhelming sense of recognition, like I had seen her before. Her face wasn't just a figment of my imagination, it was mine. The reflection staring back at me in her black eyes was my own. But I had never seen her before. I didn't know who she was. "You're too late," the woman said, her voice echoing in my skull, sending a wave of nausea through my gut. "The game is already in motion. The loop is complete." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. The loop? Was she talking about the one I had been stuck in all this time? The one I had been trying to break free from? But how could I be too late? How could there be an end to something that had no beginning, no ending, just an eternal repetition? Before I could say anything, the woman stepped aside, revealing the door behind her. The room beyond was dark, but I could make out the faint outline of something alive in the corner. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was. A body, my body, lying motionless on a cold metal table, hooked up to wires and machines, with no signs of life except for the faintest glimmer of a heartbeat on the monitor. And beside it, another figure, someone I had never seen before, standing over it, a man in a lab coat scribbling something down in a notebook. I stepped forward, trying to get a better look, but as I did, I felt something pull at me, something unnatural. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick and heavy, and the whispers intensified, rising in volume until they became an unbearable roar. I reached out for the door, but before I could touch it, the woman stepped forward, blocking my path. "There's no escape," she said, her smile widening. "You're part of the story now, you always have been." I could feel the weight of her words pressing down on me, the reality of it all sinking in. I had been chosen, a pawn in a game I couldn't understand. trapped in a system that had been running for far longer than I had known. And the worst part, I was the one who had started it. Without realizing it, I had triggered the cycle, become the catalyst for this hospital's twisted experiments, its endless hunt for answers that could never be found. I had become the patient. I had become the test subject. And in that moment, I knew. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, there was no way out. The hospital would always find me, and this game, this nightmare, would never end.